Everything you know about history was written by two men. In 65 years. I spent weeks going through their original texts, the church records, and the scholars who tried to question them. What I found, I wasn't ready for. For 300 years, every scientist who challenged the accepted timeline was silenced, discredited, or destroyed. From Isaac Newton to a Jesuit priest whose sealed letter vanished after his death. This is the story they don't want you to hear. And once you see the evidence, there is no going back. Today, we trace how the entire timeline of human civilization was manufactured. Who built it? Who tried to expose it? And why every single one of them paid the price. Chapter 1. The monk who started the clock. In the year 525, in a small monastery near Rome, a monk named Dionysius Exiguus sat down with a quill and a problem. The church needed a new system for calculating the date of Easter. What Dionysius created instead would become the foundation of all human timekeeping. No oversight. No second opinion. Just one monk in a candlelit room, deciding when the world began. He invented Anno Domini, the system that divides all of history into before Christ and after Christ. The system you use every single day. But here is the part they leave out of every textbook. Nobody knows how Dionysius calculated the year of Christ's birth. His methodology is completely lost. There is no surviving document explaining his math, no peer review, no second opinion. One monk, one calculation, one chance to get it right. And for 400 years, almost nobody used his system. It only became widespread in the 9th century. By then, it was far too late to check his work. And there is another problem. In Dionysius' system, there is no year zero. The year 1 BC is followed immediately by the year 1 AD. This is not just an inconvenience. It means every astronomical calculation that crosses this boundary, every eclipse, every comet, every alignment used to verify ancient dates, has a built-in error. Astronomers have known about this for centuries. And yet the system was never corrected. Think about that. The entire framework of human time. Every date in every history book, every century you were taught in school, rests on the work of a single man whose methods vanished 1,500 years ago. A system with a mathematical flaw at its very center, and we built all of civilization on top of it. But this was only the foundation. What came next was far more deliberate. Chapter 2. The 18-Year War on Truth. October 31st, 1517. A German monk named Martin Luther nails 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg. Within months, all of Europe is transformed. Luther's message is simple and powerful. The established church has not been telling the truth. Its authority is not what people believed. And the faithful have been kept in the dark for centuries. The church was losing control, and it needed a weapon. In 1534, a Spanish soldier named Ignatius of Loyola founded a new kind of religious order. They called themselves the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Part military unit, part intelligence service, part university system. 5 years later, the most important gathering in church history began. The Council of Trent, December 1545 to December 1563, 18 years, 25 sessions, 3 popes. This was the Catholic Church's total response to the Reformation. And the decisions made inside those walls would reshape everything humanity believed about its own past. What they decided in those sessions still shapes the world you live in today. In their 4th session, on April 8th, 1546, the Council made a decision that still affects you today. They established the final list of books that would form the Bible. 40 men in a room decided which texts were sacred and which were not. The rejected writings were removed, and anyone who questioned their decision faced serious consequences. Then they created the Index of Forbidden Books, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a master list of every book that Catholics were forbidden to read. Erasmus, Copernicus, Galileo, Giordano Bruno, who was burned alive, Voltaire, Descartes, John Locke. Over 4,000 titles across 4 centuries. It was only abolished in 1966. The same year, the Beatles released Revolver. And on February 24th, 1582, the Church changed time itself. Pope Gregory XIII signed a papal bull ordering a new calendar. The architect of mathematics was Christopher Clavius, a Jesuit. On October 4th, 1582, all of Catholic Europe went to sleep. The next morning, the calendar said October 15th. 10 days of history erased overnight. No vote was taken. No one was consulted. The Pope simply declared that 10 days of history had never existed. Protestant countries refused the new calendar. They would not submit to the Pope. England held out until 1752, Russia until 1918. But the Jesuits did not stop at Europe. Johann Adam Scholl, a Jesuit priest, became personal advisor to the Chinese emperor and reformed the Chinese calendar. Matteo Ricci, another Jesuit, discovered that Chinese records stretched back further than the Bible allowed. The Vatican's solution was not to change the Bible. It was to use a different translation with a longer timeline. Meanwhile, both sides of the religious war were building their own version of the past. The Protestants published the Magdeburg Centuries, a history designed to prove the Church had been corrupt from the beginning. The Catholics responded with the Annales Ecclesiastici, 12 massive volumes written by Cesare Baronio, the Vatican librarian, using documents from the Vatican secret archives. 2 armies, fighting not over land but over the past. Both were perfectly willing to build whatever history they needed to win. And the stage was set for 2 men to write the history of everything. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, hit subscribe and the bell icon. What comes next is something you won't find in any textbook. Chapter 3. The 2 men who built time. Joseph Justus Scaliger was born in 1540. A brilliant linguist, raised in one faith, who converted to another in his 20s. On August 24th, 1572, the night of St. Bartholomew, a wave of chaos swept across France. Thousands of people vanished overnight. Scaliger, now on the wrong side of power, fled to Geneva with nothing but his life. From exile, he began the most ambitious intellectual project in human history. In 1583, Scaliger published De Emendatione Temporum, on the restoration of times. Before this book, there was no unified timeline of world history. Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, Israel. Each civilization had its own calendar, its own dating system, its own count of the years. Scaliger took them all and stitched them into a single chronological framework. One man, one book. The entire past of the human race, organized for the first time. But Scaliger had a problem. At university ceremonies, he wore purple royal robes, claiming descent from the princes of Verona. In 1601, a Jesuit agent named Gaspar Schopp published a 400-page investigation. He found 500 false claims in Scaliger's family genealogy. The man who wrote the history of the entire world had been lying about his own history. Schopp boasted that his book killed Scaliger. And in 1609, Scaliger was dead. Now enter Dini Pato. Born in 1583, the same year Scaliger published his chronology, Pato was a Jesuit. He spent his career attacking Scaliger's work, calling it trivial and fictitious. He found 8,000 errors in Baronio's Annales Ecclesiastici. The Pope offered him a cardinal's hat. The King of Spain offered him a chair in Madrid. He refused both. In 1627, Pato published his masterwork, De Doctrina Temporum. He completed what Scaliger had started. And he introduced the system of counting years backward from Christ, BC, before Christ. The system the entire world uses today was invented by a Jesuit in 1627. Scaliger's method was ingenious, but built on assumptions. He invented something called the Julian period, a cycle of 7,980 years, calculated by multiplying 3 ancient cycles together: the solar cycle, the lunar cycle, and the Roman tax cycle. He set year 1 at 4,713 BC, earlier than any known historical date. Every event in human history was then assigned a number within the system. But the source dates he used to anchor his timeline, many came from texts that no longer exist, from chronicles that survive only as fragments, from astronomical records that may have been misinterpreted. Let that sink in. a refugee scholar and a priest from a rival order. They stood on opposite sides of the deepest divide in European history. They never met. They never agreed on anything. And yet, together, they built the framework of time that 7 billion people live inside today. 65 years. 2 men. And to this day, no one has ever fully verified their work. Chapter 4. The Great Erasure. Before you can write a new history, you have to destroy the old one. And that is exactly what happened. The Great Library of Alexandria held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. The entire knowledge of the ancient world under one roof. It was destroyed. Not once, 3 times. By Caesar in 48 BC, by Christian mobs under Bishop Theophilus in 391, and by Arab conquerors in 642. Each time, centuries of human knowledge turned to ash. But Alexandria was only the beginning. The Imperial Library of Constantinople, holding 120,000 volumes, was destroyed by Crusaders in 1204. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was razed by the Mongols in 1258. The Tigris River ran black with the ink of destroyed manuscripts. On July 12, 1562, 1 year before the Council of Trent ended, a Franciscan bishop named Diego de Landa ordered every written text of the Maya civilization burned in the town of Mani, on the Yucatan Peninsula. Thousands of codices, centuries of astronomical records, calendars, histories. De Landa wrote in his own journal, "We found many books, and since they contain nothing but superstition and the lies of the devil, we burned them all. Today, only 4 Maya codices survive, out of thousands." And the fires never stopped. Constantinople in 1204. The Crusaders burned the last great library of the ancient world. Strasbourg in 1870. 300,000 volumes lost. Leuven in 1914. German soldiers burned 300,000 books. It was rebuilt. Then in 1940, the Germans burned it again. The National Library of Sarajevo in 1992. 2 million books destroyed deliberately. Every century, the same pattern. Knowledge burning. And this was not just a European phenomenon. In 213 BC, the first emperor of unified China, Qin Shi Huang, ordered every book in his empire burned. Medical texts, agricultural manuals, and divination guides were spared. Everything else went into the flames. 460 scholars who tried to hide their books were buried alive. The emperor's goal was simple: erase everything that came before him. Start history from scratch. He even decreed that all references to previous dynasties be destroyed. Sound familiar? It worked. Today, we know almost nothing about the civilizations that came before him. Entire histories erased by imperial decree. But here is something even more unsettling. Almost every text from the ancient world that we still have is not an original. It is a copy. The works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Tacitus. Every single one exists only as a medieval copy, made by monks, centuries after the supposed original was written. The earliest manuscript of Tacitus' Annals dates to the 11th century. 1,000 years after Tacitus supposedly wrote it. The originals are gone. All of them. The Benedictine monks were the great copyists of the Middle Ages. They are the reason we have any ancient texts at all. Or at least, that is the official story. Because Jean Hardouin and Edwin Johnson, working independently 2 centuries apart, both reached the same conclusion. The Benedictines did not just copy the ancient texts, they wrote them. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in 1947 in caves near the Dead Sea, access was restricted for 40 years. A small group of scholars, mostly Catholic, controlled who could see them and who could not. When they were finally released in 1991, they contained versions of biblical texts that differed from the accepted canon. The question no one asks: what were they hiding for 4 decades? Think about what that means. Every classical text you have ever read was filtered through medieval monks, who chose what to copy and what to let rot. They decided which ideas deserved to survive. And for the Dead Sea Scrolls, the chief editor was Roland de Vaux, a Dominican friar. He controlled access for 4 decades and never published a final report. His team sat on the scrolls while the world waited. If this is making you rethink everything you learned in school, you're not alone. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And here's the question. If the dates are wrong, what else is wrong? Chapter 5. The scientists, they silenced. Now let me tell you about someone you think you know. Isaac Newton. We remember Newton for gravity, for calculus, for the laws of motion. But what you were never taught is this. Newton wrote approximately 1 million words about physics and mathematics, and 4.5 million words about theology, alchemy, and biblical chronology. The man who decoded the laws of the universe spent most of his life on something else entirely. Physics was his public work. Everything else was kept hidden for 2 centuries. Newton was an alchemist. He searched for the philosopher's stone for decades. He believed the architecture of Solomon's temple contained a coded chronology of the world. He spent years reconstructing the temple's floor plan from biblical descriptions, convinced it held the key to the true timeline of history. He secretly rejected the Holy Trinity, a heresy that could have cost him everything. These were not idle pursuits. Newton believed the ancient world contained mathematical truths the modern age had lost. His masterwork on chronology was called The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended. In it, Newton argued that Greek history had been inflated by 500 years, Egyptian history by 1,000. He calculated that ancient historians had assumed 33 years per generation when the real average was closer to 20. The result, centuries of phantom history that never happened. Phantom time. Ghost centuries. According to the greatest scientist who ever lived. Newton worked on this for decades, and he never published it. A draft leaked to France. An unauthorized translation appeared in 1724. And within months, Father Etienne Saucier, a Jesuit, published 5 dissertations attacking Newton's chronology. The greatest scientist alive, challenged not by another scientist, but by a Jesuit priest. Newton died in 1727. His chronology was published the next year. And in 1936, the economist John Maynard Keynes purchased Newton's private papers at auction. What he found shocked him. Keynes wrote, Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians. But Newton was not the first to doubt. In 1690, a Jesuit priest named Jean Hardouin was studying the writings of the early church fathers when he noticed something that changed his life. The texts did not read like authentic ancient documents. They read like medieval constructions. By 1692, Hardouin was convinced. Almost all classical literature, Greek and Roman, was forged by monks in the 13th century. He identified a mysterious figure he called Severus Arcontius as the coordinator of the forgeries. Hardouin was not some fringe figure. He was his own order's expert on history, and his own order turned against him. They pressured authorities to suppress his writings. He was forced to publicly withdraw his claims. Privately, he continued his research until the day he died. He told colleagues he would reveal everything in a sealed letter to be opened after his death. When his executors opened his papers, the letter was gone. In a fortress prison in Russia, a revolutionary named Nikolai Morozov spent 25 years in solitary confinement. He had no visitors, no colleagues, just books on astronomy. When he emerged in 1905, he'd written a 7-volume work called Christ. Using astronomical calculations, eclipses and zodiac positions, Morozov concluded that ancient history had been misdated by 300 years or more. He used the language of the stars, not politics, to challenge the timeline. 25 years in isolation with no political agenda. Just mathematics and the stars. And the stars told a different story than the textbooks. In 1950, a Russian-born psychiatrist named Immanuel Velikovsky published Ages in Chaos. He argued that Egyptian chronology was inflated by 500 years. The book became the #1 bestseller in America. And then something extraordinary happened. Before the book was even reviewed, the director of the Harvard Observatory organized a pressure campaign against the publisher. Scientists who had not read the book demanded it be pulled. 2 editors were fired. The director of the Hayden Planetarium was fired for writing a positive review. Even Carl Sagan, who disagreed with Velikovsky, called the suppression attempt the worst aspect of the whole affair. The pressure campaign was unprecedented. Macmillan, his publisher, depended on university textbook sales. When Harvard astronomers threatened to boycott those textbooks, Macmillan transferred the best-selling book to a different publisher rather than fight. This was not a scientific debate. It was economic warfare against a man whose only crime was asking inconvenient questions. Parts of his Egyptian chronology have since been supported by new archaeological discoveries. And in Moscow, a full member of the Russian Academy of Sciences named Anatoly Fomenko applied mathematical statistics to historical chronicles. He discovered that sequences of rulers' reign lengths repeat with shifts of 333 years and 1,053 years. His conclusion: the same events have been duplicated across the timeline. Ancient Rome is medieval Rome. The Trojan War is the Crusades. Everything before 1600 has been fabricated. Over 1 million copies of his books have been sold. Chess champion Garry Kasparov publicly supported his work. Heribert Illig from Germany claims 297 years were inserted into history between 614 and 911 AD, and that Charlemagne never existed. Peter James from Cambridge published Centuries of Darkness, arguing the timeline is inflated by 250 years. His own Cambridge colleague Colin Renfrew called it one of the most stimulating books on archaeology in years. David Rohl, a professional Egyptologist, argues Egyptian dates are wrong by 300 years. 3 scholars, 3 countries, 3 disciplines, and each one found the same thing. Over 300 years. France, England, Switzerland, Russia, Germany, Israel, Egypt. Working independently, never coordinating. And every single one of them reached the same conclusion. The timeline is wrong. They disagree on how much. 250 years. 300. 500. 1,000. But not one of them has ever said the date should be longer. Every single scholar who has seriously investigated the chronology has concluded that history has been stretched. And every single one of them has paid a price. The pattern holds across 3 centuries and 12 countries. Not one of these scholars set out to find a conspiracy. Each followed the evidence, and each was led to the same conclusion. Chapter 6. When forgery was fact. Now you might say these are just theories, fringe ideas from outsiders. So let me show you what happens when we catch them in the act. The Donation of Constantine was a document claiming that Emperor Constantine himself had granted the Pope authority over the entire Western Roman Empire. It was used for 700 years to justify the Church's political power. In 1440, the Italian scholar Lorenzo Valla proved it was a forgery. The Latin was wrong. The vocabulary belonged to the 8th century, not the 4th. And the Church's response? They kept using it anyway. The forger used vocabulary from the 8th century in a supposedly 4th century document. He referenced the papal tiara, which did not exist until centuries later. The deception was transparent, and it had fooled all of Europe. In 1912, a man named Charles Dawson presented the scientific world with the missing link in human evolution. A skull found in Piltdown, England. It sat in the British Museum for 41 years. 41 years of scientific papers, academic careers, and museum exhibitions built on a human skull glued to the jaw of an orangutan. The teeth had been filed. The bones had been dyed. And nobody checked. 500 academic papers were written about Piltdown Man. Entire theories of evolution were built around it. And for 4 decades, nobody thought to test the bones. In Japan, an amateur archaeologist named Shinichi Fujimura was nicknamed God's Hands because every site he touched produced extraordinary ancient artifacts. Over 20 years, he pushed Japanese prehistory back from 30,000 to 400,000 years. His discoveries entered textbooks and his dig sites became tourist attractions. In November 2000, journalists from the Mainichi Shimbun planted hidden cameras at his latest excavation. They filmed him burying 61 artifacts at night, discovered the next morning. An entire country's understanding of its own past had been built on one man's fraud. And in the Middle Ages, forgery was an industry. Churches competed for pilgrims and their money. The more relics you had, the more visitors came. John Calvin noted that if all the relics in Europe were gathered together, every apostle would have more than 4 bodies. One church proudly displayed the brain of St. Peter, until someone dropped it, and it turned out to be a piece of pumice stone. The relic trade was so vast that Chaucer satirized it in the Canterbury Tales. His partner openly admits to selling pig bones as the relics of saints. Everyone knew. And yet, the trade continued for centuries. The Donation of Constantine, 700 years. Piltdown Man, 41 years. Fujimura, 20 years. These forgeries were not discovered by the system. They were discovered despite it. And here is the question that should keep you up at night. How many forgeries are still waiting to be caught? Chapter 7. They're doing it right now. If you think rewriting history is something from the distant past, you're wrong. It's happening right now. In 2023, India quietly removed entire chapters from its national school textbooks. References to the Mughal Empire, the Gujarat violence, and the demolition of the Babri Mosque were erased overnight. 700 million students now learn a version of history that simply skips the parts the government finds inconvenient. In China, Xi Jinping has criminalized what he calls historical nihilism. Any deviation from the party line on history is now a crime. Of 3,000 museums in China, only 2 ever attempted to tell the story of the Cultural Revolution. One was shut down when journalists arrived. In Japan, new textbooks have begun replacing certain words when describing events in Nanjing. Turkey has spent millions lobbying against international recognition of events in 1915 and prosecuted Nobel laureate Orhan Pamuk for speaking about it. In the United States, the debate between the 1619 Project and the 1776 Commission shows that even the founding story of America is being rewritten in real time, depending on who holds power. And then there is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly called the Vatican Secret Archive. 85 kilometers of shelving. It was closed to all outside researchers for 269 years, from 1612 to 1881. Even today, scholars are limited to 3 document requests per day. There is no complete catalogue. Nobody knows the full contents. In 2019, Pope Francis renamed it from Secret to Apostolic. But the restrictions remain. 85 kilometers of documents, behind locked doors, in the same city where the Council of Trent decided what history would look like. Consider the scale. 85 kilometers of documents, roughly the width of the entire San Francisco Bay Area. Letters from kings, Inquisition trial records, Galileo's trial transcripts, Henry VIII's annulment petition. All behind locked doors in the same city where the Council of Trent decided what history would look like. And inside those same archives sits one of the most powerful documents in European history, the donation of Constantine. For 700 years, the Vatican used this single document to claim political authority over all of Western Europe. In 1440, a scholar named Lorenzo Valla proved it was a forgery. The Latin was wrong. The vocabulary belonged to the 8th century, not the 4th. A complete fabrication. And the Church kept using it anyway. 700 years of power, built on a document everyone eventually knew was fake. If a single forged document could control a continent for 7 centuries, consider what is possible today. And now consider this. Wikipedia has become one of the primary training sources for artificial intelligence systems like ChatGPT. Researchers have documented systematic editing campaigns on Wikipedia, where state-backed networks soften or erase controversial historical events. If you manipulate Wikipedia, you manipulate how AI understands history. George Orwell wrote it in 1949, and it has never been more true. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm telling you what happened. The timeline we all live inside was built by 2 men during the bloodiest religious war in European history in 65 years. One was a refugee who lied about his ancestry. The other was a Jesuit who spent his career attacking the first. And in 400 years, no one has ever fully verified their work. 300 years of scholars from 12 countries working independently all reached the same conclusion: something is wrong. Every single one was silenced, discredited, or ignored. And right now, in India, in China, in Japan, in Turkey, and in the United States, history is being rewritten as you watch this. The tools have changed. The game has not. The only question left is, what are you going to do about it? This is just the beginning. There is so much more to uncover. In every archive, in every museum, in every dusty collection of manuscripts, the clues are waiting. If this video opened your eyes, subscribe now and turn on the bell. Share it with someone who needs to see this. Because what comes next goes even deeper. And trust me, you are going to want to see what we have found.